Hello, my name is Dave Zick, and I'm a resident of Fort Collins, Colorado. I was homeless for 3 years until recently. About the last year and a half, I've been housed. I have an apartment. I'm currently undergoing chemotherapy. This is what's called the PIC line. Thursday, they're going to replace it with port. All right. Now, the purpose of this tape is to introduce a novel argument for homeless camping using the Eighth Amendment's cruel and unusual punishment clause, which I shall simply refer to as CAUP8. All right. Now, let me give you a rundown on the current technology for CAUP8 type of homeless camping arguments. There was the case Robinson v. California in 1962, which made the law, it shall be illegal to be addicted to the use of narcotics, cruel and unusual punishment through a highly unusual use of cruel and unusual punishment. And to get into that, let's go to the case Ingram v. Wright, 1977, where the Supreme Court outlines cruel and unusual punishment and what it is. Well, the first thing it is it limits the kind of punishment that the government can impose upon criminals post-convictively, meaning they can't handcuff you for 7 hours in the sun, like in the Philippines, which was done to a guy named Weems around 1907. They presumably can't torture you. They can't. Firing squad has been ruled to be okay as a form of execution in a state. Now that they can't tar and feather you, they can't stone you, they can't pillory you, they can't parade you through a city as they was done to Titus Oates, where you're being whipped. Titus Oates, and just before the English Bill of Rights in 1689, where the whole cruel and unusual punishment clause emanates from and begins from, and in which the word unusual back then meant illegal, and there were two forms of cruel and unusual punishment presented by the Parliament to the new king binary rulers, a man and a woman who both acted jointly as king. So this is where it all comes from. So the second kind of punishment that cruel and unusual punishment includes, as given by Ingram and White, we're down to that was the first tier. Now the second tier is the amount of, essentially, it's called proportionality. It's the amount of time that you can spend in prison for having committed a crime. And this is a hot button topic in which there is no uniform Scottish opinion on what this entails. It was this opinion of Justice Scalia that it only applies to death penalty cases. It is the opinion of Justice Thomas that it doesn't apply at all to cruel and unusual punishment, the clause of the Eighth Amendment, rather that it emanates from the Magna Carta of, I think it was around 1200 or something. So it exists as common law elsewise, but not within the cruel and unusual punishment clause. And I have no opinion on this, so I'm like, there's other Scottish opinions. Scottish reverses itself on this all of the time, saying, well, it doesn't really exist, it doesn't really comport to, the requirements of this state's law. Let it just be said that if one state has a felonious crime, In another, the same exact felonious crime in one state imposes a 10-year sentence, in the other 30. That's well within their rights, the rights of the individual states, and it doesn't comprise proportionality. Okay, now let's be done with those two first tiers, because for the rest of this tape, they're irrelevant. And for camping laws, they're irrelevant. Okay. What matters is the third tier within Ingram right, which I quote, the SCOTUS says, cruel and unusual punishment imposes substantive limits on what can be made criminal and punished as such. So here we go. This is a different kind of restriction. The first two have to do with post-convictive punishments, forms of punishment. And you will find prosecutors everywhere saying the cruel and unusual punishment only applies to post-convictive forms of punishment. And they are right. That is Scottish case law. But this third tier doesn't directly involve any forms of punishment. It involves the coupling of lawmaking and punishment. Okay, in the case Robinson, somewhere it says that it would be cruel and unusual punishment to impose even 1 day in jail for the crime of having the common cold. This is an example of lawmaking, made law, coupled with punishment. So what it really does is it imposes restrictions on the governments or states, state government, whatever, cities within states, which is state, to make laws that are coupled with non-zero punishment forms, fines, jail time. Okay, all laws have punishments, basically. There may be some exceptions that the Supreme Court actually asked for in this case, and I think that the counsel that the Supreme Court asked of this, I can't remember the case, I saw it live, was looking far and wide for some, and they're hard to find. They're more like park regulations and stuff like that, like federal parks, if they do exist. But what we're talking about now for the rest of this tape is a crime which has a non-zero punishment, meaning jail time, fines, or both. Okay, so now I was going to outline the problem that I'm having with the current forms of argument. The major form of argument is the Martin Boise type of argument, in which case one takes the conditions of Robinson. Now, Robinson was ruled to be cruel and unusual punishment under the condition imposes substantive limits on what can be made criminal and punished as such. But it's the only law so far. It shall be illegal to be addicted to use of narcotics that has been ruled that way. The case Powell v. Texas had to do with alcoholism. That was a 4-1-4 decision. It was a tie. One justice stepping out. That decision hinged upon one justice not knowing, because it wasn't in the record, whether or not Powell was homeless or not. If Powell had been definitely homeless, he definitely would have ruled, and that in a way such that Powell would have won. I think this is Justice White who said this. In his opinion, Justice White gave separate opinions in both Robinson and Powell, and my opinion is that he was on the ball. He was the one that's most on the ball. And I have another argument for that that's irrelevant for this. This discourse here. I'm talking about introducing a novel argument and why it's high time. Okay, so let's look at what is said after imposes substantive limits on what could be made criminal and punished as such. In the case Ingram v. Wright, 1977. The next thing that the Supreme Court said is this should be used sparingly. Okay, what does sparingly mean? Well, we don't really know. I mean, it's all kind of relative, but Powell was used 6 years after Robinson, although it was piggybacking on Robinson, so it wasn't a unique, novel argument. It rather relied upon Robinson. So sparingly probably doesn't apply. But it's been 60 years since Robinson. Robinson was an 1862 case. It's high time, I think. I think that it's been sparingly enough. Because sparingly also can be looked at as fractional in terms of pure number of cases brought before, not heard by the Supreme Court, but applied to the Supreme Court to be heard. These days, the Supreme Court hears about 70 cases a year, but has 7,000 applications for cases to be heard each year. They could only hear 1% of the cases that could be heard. So, in terms of sheer numbers of laws also being made, people have been moving into the cities over the past 50 years. The percentage of the population has been rising, urban. This is, you can find this on Google. There are a lot more people, so there's a lot more laws that need to be made by cities, and cities have been making a lot more laws. So there's a lot more opportunity for laws to fall short of their constitutionality vis-a-vis this principle espoused within Ingram Right. And so sparingly in terms of sheer proportionality of the number of laws made ought to be met now. So it's high time for a new cruel and unusual punishment argument, I think, that involves homeless camping. And so here it is. Here's my argument. Okay, well, how did I get about this argument? Well, I looked at all of the animal rights laws in all 50 states. And I found that in 46 states, 46 states require pets to be sheltered. Okay. If they aren't sheltered, it's animal cruelty. So sheltering your pet from the elements according to its kind is a requirement. If you don't do it, you're committing the act of animal cruelty. So if it's cruel to a pet who has fur, it ought to be cruel to a human being who doesn't. Human beings ought to have rights that are at least as good or as life protecting, as protective as their pets. This is a law which, like the law of Denver, which defines shelter to be anything not worn on your back, and then which forbids somebody from using it to protect themselves from the elements, ought to be unconstitutional, because automatically we see that it's cruel to the human being. If it's cruel to a pet, it's cruel to a human being. Now, it's not a form of punishment, as in cruel and unusual punishment, because that's post-convictive. But it is a form of self-punishment. If you look about how laws, how society functions and what holds society together, how laws impose a kind of intelligence upon society so it doesn't faction into warring elements that tend to destroy each other. It protects individuals, the smallest unit possible of personhood within, legal unit of personhood there's a way of analysis where you could get an even finer mesh that I've used before. But when you look at it, laws protect people. They're important for society. How does the law function? Well, how does a law is being made? The legislature has some purpose, and the purpose is supposedly furthered by people complying with the law once it's been enacted. So you get a bunch of people following the law. It's like the government orchestrates the people, like a big conductor in a symphony, getting them to march stepwise, which fulfills the legislative purpose of the law, which changes society in relationship to itself to adjust to new things, or it changes the relationship of society with respect to its environment, which is everything that is not society. So, all right. There's another way of looking at it from plant biology. Recent science indicates that many ecosystems of plant life have a certain intelligence that arises out of the fungal system that it connects the plants together. And the fungal system itself is called the Wood Wide Web. That's WOOD WIDE WEB. An example of how this works and what this fungal network provides to the plant life is that it borrows nutrients from the plants. It also helps the plants get nutrients. Also, it forms a chemical signaling network between plants, and plants respond to their surroundings in a different way than each plant would individually because they're connected. An example of this is an experiment done on mimosa plants. If you have a mimosa plant, it's kind of Venus flytraps are very quick acting in terms of a Venus flytrap comes, you have a fly, and the Venus flytrap will like close around the fly and eat the fly or ingest the fly, use the fly as nutrients by tickling some of the hairs on the Venus flytrap. Well, mimosa plants are not like that, but mimosa plants do respond. They're sitting there like their leaves can very suddenly close up. If an offending insect comes and sits and bites a mimosa plant, it will protect itself by its leaf covering up and closing up. How does it do this? Well, all the moisture in the leaves, or most of the moisture, the water, goes down the stem. Okay, well, it has been discovered by experiment that if you have a field of mimosa plants with the fungal wood wide web interconnecting them so that they chemically signal each other, that if you have a mimosa plant here and a remote mimosa plant there, and you have an offending insect that is threatening to the plant here, and that this leaf will close, this leaf closes in response, even though it's kind of a remote action at a distance, although it doesn't violate any laws of physics. Believe me, I taught physics for 20 years, so it's a slow-acting system. It's not instantaneous. But okay, so this is a kind of intelligence that plant life has due to its network. What are laws? Laws are a network which harmonizes society in order for society to cohere, to persist over time, and in order for people to live fruitful and happy lives within society, instead of having society dissipate into warring factions or whatever. So lawmaking itself imposes a kind of intelligence upon society. Therefore, if a law has a legitimate purpose, not all laws have legitimate purposes, but if a law is written for a good reason, the legislative purpose, enacting the legislative purpose, how is that done? Well, it's done by having people comply with the law. Now, when I said that not all laws have legitimate purposes, I mean the vast majority of them, maybe like 1 in a million doesn't. A law like the City of Fort Collins City Ordinance 17-181 has illegitimate purposes that aren't expressed in the published legislative intent of the law. If you write a law with a legitimate purpose and you change the law to do the opposite, all of the acts do the opposite. That would be an example, and you made that a law. That would be an example of a law with an illegitimate purpose. It makes everything worse instead of better in society. Not that the Constitution binds the legislative body, essentially. The legislative body is only bound by the Constitution through a couple of clauses. Basically, the First Amendment, which says, Congress shall make no law, blah, blah, blah. And then the 14th Amendment, Privileges and Immunities Act, no state shall make and enforce any law which violates, I don't remember the exact words, the privileges and immunities of the citizens of the United States, which is interpreted to be anybody in the United States, even visitors. And there's another 14th Amendment restriction, which is very rarely used, but which constitutes a facial challenge to a law. And then there's the 8th Amendment. Ingram Wright, cruel and unusual punishment imposes substantive limits on what can be made criminal and punished as such. That binds the legislative body into not making laws which are cruel and unusual, right? It restricts the legislative body. Now, it doesn't, and the way it does that is sort of through the judiciary. The judicial branch of government has to rule on the legislative branch's lawmaking practice. And this is what is allowed. These branches thought to be separate. They're interacting. They're weakly interacting. That's a physics term. Anyway, so my argument is basically that making a law which imposes animal cruelty upon a human being, which requires a human being to not shelter themselves from the elements, something which is allowable and required for pets, that also breaches the substantive limit imposed by the 8th Amendment's cruel and unusual punishment clause, that it's a kind of law which violates the Constitution. Okay, cruel and unusual punishment imposes substantive limits on what can be made criminal and punished as such. And I'm saying that such laws which disallow human beings to use their own shelter to protect themselves from the elements, when by law, if they had a pet, they would be required to use that shelter to protect their pets from the elements, else fall, askew of animal cruelty laws. That oversteps the restrictions imposed upon the legislative body by the 8th Amendment. And that's the end of my argument. So it would be up to a judge to consider whether or not she or he believes this is the case, whether it really oversteps his bound. This is a completely novel argument. And it doesn't rely on Robinson. It doesn't rely on Powell. It doesn't rely on Martin Boise. It doesn't rely on Pottinger. It doesn't rely on Jones. It doesn't rely on any other law. It doesn't rely on Weimold. So it's a new start, and it's about time. And the sparing the condition, it has been sparingly enough high time for a novel argument. That's the end of my argument. Thank you and have a good day.